I was rinsing my breakfast plate when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. It was a Tuesday morning in late autumn, the kind of gray, quiet morning where the magpies go silent and the whole yard feels like it's holding its breath. I'd been up since 5. The way I always am now, that my knees won't let me sleep past dawn. I'd had my 2 pieces of toast, my black tea, and I was standing at the sink looking out at the back paddock, watching the mist sit low over the grass the way it does in Goulburn when the cold comes early. The number on the screen said private. I almost let it go to voicemail. I picked up on the 4th ring. "Is this Douglas Hartigan?" The voice was formal. A woman. Measured. "It is," I said. "Mr. Hartigan, my name is Patricia Wen. I'm a solicitor with Wen and Associates in Sydney. I'm calling regarding the estate of the late Mr. Raymond Coulter." I set my plate down on the bench. Raymond Coulter. I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in nearly 40 years. He was my mother's first cousin, which made him some kind of second cousin to me, though we'd never been particularly close. We'd met perhaps a dozen times in my entire life at funerals mostly, and one Christmas gathering at my grandmother's house in Orange when I was still a young man. Raymond had been older than me by about 20 years. A quiet, serious man who'd built a cattle property out past Cooma and never married. The last I'd heard of him was through my sister, who'd mentioned in passing that he was getting on in years and wasn't well. I wasn't aware Raymond had passed, I said. "I'm sorry to hear it. He passed 6 weeks ago," Patricia Wen said, peacefully, "at his property. Mr. Hartigan, the reason I'm calling is that you are named as the primary beneficiary in Mr. Coulter's will." I heard the words. I understood each one individually. And yet for a moment, they refused to assemble themselves into anything that made sense. "I'm sorry," I said. "Could you say that again?" "You are the primary beneficiary of Mr. Coulter's estate," she said. "That includes his property Willow Bend Station, approximately 1,400 hectares outside Cooma, and his financial holdings, which total just under $4 million after taxes and legal costs are settled." I sat down on the kitchen stool. I don't remember deciding to sit. My legs simply stopped holding me upright. "Mr. Hartigan, are you still with me?" "I'm here," I said. Why me?" "We barely knew each other. Mr. Coulter left a letter with the will," she said. "I can read you the relevant passage if you'd like." "Please." She cleared her throat. He wrote, "Douglas was always decent to me. Nothing more complicated than that. He shook my hand at my mother's funeral, when no one else bothered to speak to me. He sent a card when I had my surgery. He remembered I was alive when the rest of them forgot. That's worth something. That's worth everything, actually." I sat there in my kitchen in Goulburn, and I did not speak for a long moment. "Mr. Hartigan, I'm here," I said again. I need a moment." She gave me the moment. Outside, the mist was beginning to lift. A pair of rosellas landed on the fence post near the water trough, bright as paint against the gray morning. I was 63 years old. I had worked for 37 years as a secondary school woodwork teacher at a school 20 minutes from where I grew up. I had never owned more than my modest house on Clyde Street, a 10-year-old ute, and whatever was sitting in my superannuation account. My wife, Gloria, had passed away 4 years earlier from a stroke. My 2 children, my son Warren, who was 38, and my daughter Bree, who was 35, lived within 40 minutes of me and visited, on average, perhaps 4 times a year. $4 million and 1,400 hectares of land was not a thing that happened to men like me. "What do I need to do?" I asked. Patricia Wen walked me through the next steps. There would be paperwork, meetings in Sydney, evaluation of the property. She said she'd send everything through in writing. I wrote down her number on the back of an envelope and thanked her and hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time without moving. The first person I thought to call was my son Warren. I should explain something about Warren. He was not a bad person. He had never been a bad person. But somewhere in his mid-30s he had become a busy person. And busy, in Warren's case, had come to mean that everything else, including me, sat in a queue behind his work, his mortgage, his wife Karen's schedule, and whatever crisis was currently unfolding in his particular corner of the world. He called me on my birthday. He came for Christmas if Karen's family didn't have a prior claim on the date. He had come to his mother's funeral and stayed 2 days, and then driven back to Canberra because he had a meeting on Thursday that couldn't be moved. I called him at 9:30 that morning. He answered on the third ring, which meant he wasn't in a meeting yet. "Dad, everything all right? I've just had some unusual news," I said. "Do you have a minute?" "I've got about 5, he said. "Karen and I are taking the kids to her parents' place this weekend, so I'm trying to get ahead of a few things before Friday." "Of course," I said. "I'll be quick." I told him about Raymond. I told him about the property. I told him about the $4 million. There was a silence on the line. "Wait," Warren said. "$4 million? That's what the solicitor said." Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way I noticed but didn't comment on. It had become warmer, more attentive, like a window that had been shut for a long time being opened. "Dad, that's extraordinary. How are you feeling about it?" "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly. "It's a lot to take in." "Of course it is. Listen, you should probably get a financial advisor involved fairly quickly. And maybe a second solicitor, just to review everything. Karen's father might know someone he's had some experience with estate law." "I'll look into it," I said. "And Dad, the property. 1,400 hectares, you said? Out past Cooma?" "That's what she said. That's significant land. Depending on the water access and the condition of the infrastructure, that alone could be worth quite a bit more than the cash component. You'd want to get someone out there to assess it properly." He spoke for another 4 minutes about asset management and tax implications and not making any hasty decisions. It was sensible advice. It was the most sustained attention Warren had given me in years. And somewhere underneath the sensible advice, I felt something I did not like, feeling a quiet, hollow recognition that the man on the phone was not quite talking to me. He was talking to the property and the $4 million, and I just happened to be standing in front of them. We hung up and I made another cup of tea. My daughter Bree called me 40 minutes later. I hadn't called her yet, which meant Warren had. "Dad," she said, and I could hear she'd been rehearsing the tone. Warren told me. "I just wanted to ring and see how you're doing." "I'm all right," I said. Still a bit stunned. "Of course you are. It's such wonderful news, though, isn't it? Dad, honestly, you deserve this. After everything you've been through with Mum, you deserve something good." I noted the timing of the sentiment. 4 years since Gloria passed, 2 years since I'd mentioned, during one of our rare Sunday phone calls, that I was finding it hard to manage the upkeep on the house alone. Bree had so many hard, and that she'd try to get up more often. She had come once since then, in spring, and stayed for lunch. "It's certainly unexpected," I said. "Have you thought about what you'll do? I mean, obviously there's no rush, but the property sounds incredible. Would you consider moving out there? Or selling?" "I haven't thought about much yet. It only happened this morning." "Right, of course. Sorry." A pause. "Warren mentioned you might want a financial advisor. I actually know someone, if you want the details." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. We talked for 20 minutes, which was longer than our usual calls. She asked about my health, which she hadn't done in some time. She asked about the garden and whether I'd managed to get the gutters fixed. She said she should come up soon, maybe next month, and she really meant it this time. I said that would be nice. After I hung up, I went and sat in the back garden for a while. The mist had fully cleared. The paddock beyond the fence line was gold green in the late morning light, and the air smelled like eucalyptus and cold dirt, the way it always smells in Goulburn after a cold night. Gloria used to sit out here with me on mornings like this. She'd bring her coffee and her crossword, and we'd just be quiet together, which is a thing I hadn't understood the value of until she wasn't there anymore. I thought about Raymond Coulter, standing alone at his mother's funeral. A man I'd spoken to perhaps a dozen times in my life. A man who had written, in his final document on this earth, that I had remembered he was alive when the rest of them forgot. I thought, I wonder if he had children. I wonder if he had anyone. I also thought, sitting there in my garden, about a test. It wasn't something I'd planned. It was more like a thought that arrived fully formed, the way certain thoughts do when you've gone quiet enough to hear them. I had just received news that I was suddenly and unexpectedly wealthy, and within 90 minutes of that news, both of my children had called me, and both conversations had felt subtly different from every conversation I'd had with them in the past 4 years. I wanted to know something. I wanted to know it clearly, without the money in the way. So I made a decision. I did not call my solicitor back that day. I did not tell anyone else about the will. What I did instead was wait 2 weeks. 2 ordinary weeks, in which Warren called once about the financial advisor, and Bree sent a message saying she'd been meaning to visit. And then I rang them both with a different piece of news. I told them I'd been to see my GP. I told them the doctor had found something in my blood work that needed further investigation. I told them I was managing, but that the tests had come back with some indicators that concerned the doctor, and that there was a medication he wanted to put me on, a specialist medication that my pension or healthcare didn't cover, and that cost $750 a month. I told them I wasn't asking for anything. I just wanted them to know. Warren listened. He asked a few clarifying questions about what kind of specialist I was seeing. And then he said, "Dad, look, Karen and I have been stretched pretty thin since we took on the renovation. I don't think we're in a position to help financially right now. Have you looked into whether there are any concession options through the PBS?" "I'll look into it," I said. "Good. And let me know how the tests go." Bree's response was gentler in delivery and identical in substance. She said she was so sorry I was dealing with this. She said she wished she could do more. She said the kids' school fees had gone up and they were trying to pay down the car, and honestly, if it had been any other time, she would have been straight in the car, but right now, it just wasn't possible. She said she'd call to check in. She didn't call that week. I sat with all of it. I didn't feel sorry for myself, not quite. I felt something more like clarity. Like when you've been squinting at something in bad light for a long time and someone turns the lamp on, and you can finally see exactly what it is you've been looking at. Now I need to tell you about my nephew, Callum. He was 22 years old, and he was my late sister Margot's boy. Margot had died when Callum was 16, a brain aneurysm, sudden and entirely without warning, the kind of thing that makes you understand that the world has no obligation to make sense. She'd been a single mother, Margot. And after she died, Callum had gone to live with her ex-partner, a decent enough man called Brian who did his best. Brian had since moved to Queensland. Callum had stayed in New South Wales. He worked at a hardware store in Yass, 40 minutes from me. He drove a beaten-up 2009 Corolla. He called me Uncle Doug. He came to see me 3 or 4 times a year, not because anything was expected of him, but simply because, as he once told me, I was the only family he had left who cooked a proper roast. I had not told Callum about the inheritance, and I had not told him about the false illness story I'd told his cousins. 3 days after my calls to Warren and Bree, Callum rang me on a Saturday morning. "Uncle Doug, Mick at the shop mentioned he saw your car outside the medical center twice this week. You all right?" Mick at the shop. Of course. Yass isn't far from Goulburn, and small towns talk. I hadn't anticipated that. I said something vague about some routine tests and not to worry. Is it serious? He said. Straight. No preamble. Possibly. They're not certain yet. What can I do? Nothing, mate. Honestly. I'm managing. There was a pause and then he said, I'm coming Sunday. Callum. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He said. I'll be there by noon. I'll bring lunch. Do you still like that Thai place on the main street? He came. He sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours. He didn't ask about money. He didn't ask about the house, or what my plans were, or whether I'd made a will. He asked about how I was sleeping. He asked whether I was eating properly. He fixed the laundry door that had been sticking for 3 months because I'd mentioned it in passing 6 weeks earlier, and apparently he'd remembered. When he was leaving, he stood at the door and said, I'm putting my number in your phone under Call Me First. If anything changes with the tests, or if you just need to talk, you call me before you call anyone else. Okay? I nodded, because I didn't trust my voice right at that moment. He drove 40 minutes home in his beaten-up Corolla. I thought about Raymond Coulter. I thought about a handshake at a funeral and a card after a surgery, and how those small, ordinary gestures of decency had stayed with a man for 40 years. I thought about how we underestimate what it costs a person to show up when showing up is inconvenient, when there's nothing in it for them, when the world will not notice or applaud. I thought, I understand you now, Raymond. I finally understand exactly what you saw. The following week, I rang Patricia Wen and asked whether the estate process could be expedited. She said it could, within reason. The paperwork was largely in order, and probate had already been filed. She estimated we were looking at perhaps 8 to 10 weeks until formal transfer. I also made an appointment with a different solicitor, one I found independently, not through Warren's suggestion or Bree's contact, and I began the process of reviewing my own will. Then I rang Warren. I told him the tests had come back. I told him the news was good. The specialist had revised his initial concern, and the medication wouldn't be needed after all. I said I was relieved and that I appreciated him being there for me during the uncertainty. He said, "Oh, brilliant, Dad. That's a huge relief. Honestly, I've been thinking about you." I said I was also ringing because there was something else I needed to tell him. Something I hadn't mentioned before because I'd wanted to process it quietly first. I received some news several weeks ago, I said. A distant relative, my mother's cousin Raymond, passed away and left me his estate. Silence. Left you his estate? Warren repeated. His property outside Cooma. And just under $4 million. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the particular quality of the silence that follows a number like that when it lands in a room. "Dad," he said. That's extraordinary. Why didn't you tell us?" "I wanted to be sure of it first," I said. "And I wanted to see how things were." There was something in the way I said the last sentence. I didn't intend it to land with weight, but it did. I felt him pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, see how things were?" I said it plainly, because he deserved plainness. I told him I'd noticed the conversations after the inheritance news and before it were very different in quality. I told him I'd made up the story about the medication to understand something I needed to understand. I told him I was not calling to blame him for anything or to have a fight. I was calling because I loved him, and because I thought we deserved honesty between us. The silence stretched longer this time. When he spoke, his voice was different. Quieter. "Dad, He stopped. Started again. "I'm sorry about the medication thing. I should have handled that differently." "You should have," I agreed, gently. "I didn't know you were struggling." "You didn't ask," I said. "You haven't asked in quite a while." He didn't argue with that. I respected him for not arguing with it. There was a long pause in which I think he was sitting with something uncomfortable and choosing not to run away from it. "What happens now?" he said. "I don't know exactly. I'm still deciding about the property. But I wanted you to hear it from me directly. and I wanted to have an honest conversation. Whatever comes next between us needs to be based on something real, not on what's in my bank account. He said he understood. He said he was sorry. I believed both things. The call with Bree was harder. She cried, which I hadn't expected. She said she was ashamed, which I also hadn't expected, and which told me something about her. I was glad to know that somewhere beneath the busyness and the excuses, there was still a person who felt things clearly enough to be ashamed of herself when she'd been unkind. I told her I didn't want her shame. I told her I wanted her presence when she could give it. Not obligation, just showing up. The way Callum shows up, not because anything is owed, but because that's what loving someone looks like in practice. She came the following weekend. She didn't bring an agenda. She sat with me in the garden and we talked about her mother, which we hadn't done properly in years. We talked about Warren and Bree's own childhood and things I'd perhaps done better and worse as a father. It was an honest conversation, an uncomfortable one, a necessary one. I made a decision about the property in the weeks that followed. Willow Bend Station was everything Patricia Wen had described and more. I drove out on a clear morning in July with a property manager called Jim who'd been running the cattle operation for Raymond for the last decade. He walked me around in the cold winter light, the dry stone fences, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, the old homestead with its wide veranda, and the mountains on the horizon. I understood why Raymond had loved it. I understood why he'd never left. I decided not to sell it. I decided to keep it and to move there, which surprised everyone, including me. Warren thought it was impractical. Bree worried about the distance. But I was 63 years old and I was not tired yet. And the land reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten about myself, that I was, at heart, a man who belonged outdoors. I told Jim he could stay on to run the cattle operation for as long as he wanted. I sat with my solicitor and I revised my will. I left something meaningful to both Warren and Bree. They were my children, and I loved them. And the conversations we'd had since all of this began had shifted something between us in ways that I thought were worth building on. I did not punish them. I was not interested in punishment. But I left the largest share, the property itself, the house, the land Raymond had loved enough to entrust to me, to Callum. He didn't know it yet. He might not know it for many years, I hoped. What he did know was that I'd invited him to Willow Bend the following month, and that he'd arrived on a Saturday in August in his beaten-up Corolla with a bag of groceries and that same straightforward ease he always carried. He'd stood on the veranda and looked out at the mountains and said quietly, "Uncle Doug, this is something else." "It is," I said. We stood there together for a while in the cold, clear air. I thought about what Raymond had written. He remembered I was alive when the rest of them forgot. I thought about all the ways we communicate love without naming it: a card in the mail, a phone call after surgery, driving 40 minutes on a Sunday with Thai takeaway because someone mentioned they weren't feeling well. I thought about how rarely we notice the people doing those things until we stop and look, properly look, at who's there when the ordinary days are ordinary and nothing is on offer except the company. There's a thing I've come to understand, standing on that veranda in the Monaro winter, that I wish I'd understood when I was younger. Money is not nothing. Security matters. But what a person chooses to do when there is nothing in it for them, when they're not being watched, when no inheritance is on the table, when it's just an unremarkable Tuesday and someone needs them, that is the truest thing about a person. That is the only test that means anything. Raymond knew it. He'd been watching for it his whole life, probably. And when he found it, even in a small form, even in something as quiet as a handshake at a funeral, he held on to it. He built his whole final act of generosity around it. I am not a wealthy man by temperament. I am still, in some essential way, the woodwork teacher from Goulburn who gets up before dawn and drinks black tea and worries about sticking laundry doors. But I have 1,400 hectares of country I have come to love, and a nephew who fixed my laundry door before he knew any of it existed. And I have learned, later than I should have, but not too late, to pay very close attention to who shows up on the ordinary days. Those are the ones who are telling you the truth.